Stop. Before you proceed, close your eyes and feel the cold. Not the comfortable chill of an air-conditioned room, but the bone-aching, lethal freeze of the Persian Highlands, 6 centuries before the birth of Christ. This was a place where winter didn't just visit, it settled in like an occupying army, determined to freeze the very breath in your lungs.
Can you believe that entire communities managed to vanish from the surface, not through magic, but through sheer, desperate engineering? They were masters of the subterranean world. They didn't live on the desolate plateau. They lived inside it. Earth-insulated homes, often dug 20 feet down into the high desert soil, were their only salvation. These were warm pockets of desperate breath, built to withstand the impossible cold, the scouring winds, and the relentless hunger of the surrounding empires. They believed the crushing weight of the earth overhead was their guarantee against famine, against invasion, and against the blood-soaked ambition of kings. But tonight, in the suffocating darkness of a farmer named Mithra's home, that guarantee was worthless. Beneath the protective dome of packed clay and mud brick, a catastrophe no one saw coming was already breathing down their necks. It wasn't the drought, and it wasn't the Scythian raiders sweeping in from the east. It was something far more intimate, far more terrifying, a silent, creeping betrayal that would redefine the entire map of the ancient world and forge the future King of Kings. The air inside Mithra's chamber was thick with the scent of burning sheep dung and low-grade, simmering panic. For 3 generations, his family had survived here, in this perfectly concealed, insulated warren. He considered the deep earth his armor, his shield against the overwhelming power of the Median overlords who ruled the region from their glittering capital at Ecbatana. The true danger, however, does not come from the sky or the open field. It rises from the ground, carried by whispers. And tonight, those whispers had become deafeningly loud. The noise started subtly, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump from the upper village, the kind of sound that normally meant a repair or routine maintenance on a critical wellhead. But tonight, the pattern was wrong. It was too insistent, too heavy. It carried the metallic, unforgiving ring of military equipment being dragged across frozen ground, followed by the sickening crunch of something heavy impacting packed earth. Mithra's wife, Ilara, clutched their infant son closer to the smoky hearth, her eyes wide with a primal fear that transcended logic. She knew that sound. Every soul in the vassal Persian Highlands knew that sound. It was the sound of the Median king Astyages, the lion of Ecbatana, remembering that his distant, humble subjects still drew breath, and that their humility might be a dangerous disguise.
Astyages was defined by his iron fist and his relentless, consuming paranoia. For decades, he had kept the Persian clans, the very people burrowed beneath the earth right now, in a state of suffocating, desperate subservience. But in the freezing darkness of 600 BCE, the ancient order was cracking.
The pressure between the Median overlords and the Persian people had reached critical mass, amplified by intense, dangerous rumors. Rumors of a new leader, a young man who was not content to hide in the shadows of the earth, but who dared to walk in the blinding glare of destiny. This man, they whispered in hushed tones that could get you executed instantly, was named Cyrus. And he was the spark Astyages desperately sought to extinguish. Mithra rose slowly, his old leather armor stored carefully beneath the sleeping mat, creaking like dry ice as he moved. He crept toward the ventilation shaft, the narrow, carefully disguised conduit that was the only connection between his safe, subterranean world and the brutal, frozen reality above. He pressed his ear to the cool, packed earth lining the shaft, trying to filter out the howling wind and hear the truth, to confirm the terror his heart already knew. The terrible thump, thump, thump had stopped completely. Now there was only the absolute, suffocating silence that precedes the slaughter. A silence far worse than any noise. He knew the Median soldiers were masters of infiltration. They didn't need to storm walls. They located the fragile points, the wells, the shafts, the cleverly hidden entrances to the underground warrens. And to find those points, they needed a guide. They needed a traitor. A catastrophic failure of trust. A conspiracy forged not by foreign enemies, but by neighbors within a very village Mithra had helped build and protect. This was the moment where the earth-insulated home transitioned instantly from a sanctuary to a tomb. Suddenly, a sharp, deafening crack echoed violently down the shaft, making his teeth ache. It sounded exactly like the world above had fractured completely. Dust and fine grit rained down onto the hearth fire, causing the small room to instantly choke on thick, acrid smoke. They weren't just searching, they were violently breaching the perimeter. Mithra grabbed his bronze axe, its edge dull from years of storage, but still heavy with dangerous intent. He knew they couldn't fight an entire Median detachment from this tiny chamber, but he could buy Elara and the boy precious time. He looked at his wife, her face painted by terror and the frantic firelight. "The secondary tunnel," he rasped, his voice rough and raw. "Go now. Don't look back. Find the others at the Eastern Qanat outlet. I will follow." This was not just an attack on a random isolated village. This was the hammer blow that shattered the fragile, manufactured peace of the entire Persian vassal state. It was the explosive opening scene in the ultimate drama of ancient power, where a humble, desert-dwelling people, driven by nothing but the desperation of survival, would rise from the darkness. The air grew impossibly colder, the choking dust heavier. Above them, the Medes were dismantling their world, brick by painstaking brick. And Mithra realized the terrible irony. The very secrecy that kept them safe was now drawing the furious eyes of the lion. The earth-insulated homes were targets because inside them slept the future army of the King of Kings. The Medes were searching for the spark that would ignite the rebellion. They were searching for Cyrus, and tonight they had come to the wrong hole in the ground. But they had found the right level of desperate, life-or-death resistance. The story of the Persian Empire did not begin on a golden throne. It began right here, in the icy, collapsing darkness of a farmer's hidden home, 6 centuries before Christ, as the earth groaned in protest against the betrayal unfolding within its walls. The betrayal did not arrive as a screaming war trumpet or the roar of 10,000 chariots. It arrived as a silent, creeping frost, chilling the blood far deeper than the relentless cold of the Median night. Inside the subterranean dwelling, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and the lingering dread that permeated every mud brick joint. A silent accusation against the vassal state of Parsumash and its Achaemenid rulers. For years they had played the loyal subject, bowing low to the Median king Astyages, trading their fierce independence for a temporary, brittle peace that now threatened to shatter them completely. King Astyages, ruling from the glittering heights of Ecbatana, was not merely a monarch, he was a walking monument to geopolitical neurosis, a king whose tyranny was rooted not in greed for land, but in paralyzing fear of a shadow that had visited him only in his dreams. He was obsessed, utterly consumed by a pair of visions delivered by his Magian priests, portents so terrifying they drove him to commit atrocities against his own lineage. The first dream was a tidal wave of terror. Astyages saw his daughter, Mandane, married to the Persian Cambyses I, give birth to a torrent of water that swelled and rose, eventually flooding and drowning not just his palace, but the entirety of Asia. Think of the sheer psychological terror this implied. His own grandson, a Persian child, destined to wipe the Median Empire off the map. The second dream, even more unnerving, showed the same grandson, the soon-to-be-born Cyrus, sprouting a massive vine from his loins. This vine, impossibly strong, wrapped itself around the whole world, casting Astyages' throne into perpetual darkness. In the ancient world, dreams were not psychology. They were fate, undeniable and lethal. Astyages, utterly convinced he was fighting destiny itself, acted with calculated ruthlessness. He had tried everything to circumvent the prophecies, including keeping Mandane close to him in Ecbatana and marrying her off to a Persian vassal he mistakenly deemed weak and manageable, Cambyses I, the king of Anshan. But even this carefully controlled union produced the dreaded seed, Cyrus. Now the Median spy network, a terrifying web of informers and double agents financed by the vast Median treasury, was tightening its coil around every Achaemenid household, seeking the exact moment of the child's birth. The earth-insulated homes, built precisely to withstand the elements and provide privacy, were now, ironically, the focus of the empire's most intense scrutiny. Every whisper, every celebration, every new delivery of swaddling clothes was reported back to the Median garrisons scattered across the highlands. These garrisons were the iron fist of Astyages, maintaining a chilling stability through constant, random acts of cruelty, and heavy taxation that starved the Persian farmers while funding the lavish courts of the Magian priests, who continued to fuel the king's paranoia. The man inside the mud-brick home, a loyal lieutenant of Cambyses, knew that the Median patrols outside were not simply searching for bandits or collecting tribute. They were hunting for a sign. They were looking for the faintest flicker of resistance, the slightest deviation from the required posture of subservience that would justify a full-scale purge of the Achaemenid clan. The betrayal that ended the last segment, that silent crack in the loyalty of the Persian nobles, was the direct result of Astyages' strategy. Make survival so precarious and the reward for cooperation so high that every man would eventually turn on his neighbor to protect his own skin. The Median agents were offering land, immunity from tax, and political elevation to any Persian who would deliver critical intelligence on Cambyses I, and, most importantly, on the whereabouts and status of the prophesied infant, Cyrus. It was a Faustian bargain offered in the bitter cold, and too many desperate men had already taken it. The lieutenant, shivering beside a dying fire, understood the calculus of despair. If he sheltered the family, he condemned his own. If he revealed them, he secured his life, but damned his honor and the future of his people. That was the crushing dilemma Astyages had engineered, a brilliant maneuver of social warfare designed to collapse the Persian resistance from the inside out. Suddenly, a muffled sound from above the packed earth ceiling, a dull thud, heavy and decisive. It was not the wind. It was not the shifting earth. It was the deliberate weight of a boot on the roof, precisely where the concealed ventilation shaft led down into their sanctuary. The sanctuary was breached. Every occupant froze, their breath catching in the icy air. The light from the single oil lamp seemed to shrink, highlighting the terrified eyes staring upward. They had believed the thickness of the earth was their shield, the insulating layers of clay and stone their guarantee of invisibility. But Astyages' eyes were everywhere. The silence that followed was agonizing, stretching out like a wire pulled taut before snapping. The lieutenant reached slowly for the short bronze dagger strapped to his waist, his mind racing through escape routes that didn't exist in the claustrophobic underground chamber. The Medes hadn't just found them, they had been led right to their threshold, guided by the whispering fear of one of their own kin. The lieutenant closed his eyes, remembering the fierce, quiet instructions of Cambyses I, the king who knew his son was a target long before the dreams were publicized. There was only one way out of this trap, and it required a sacrifice greater than anything the Medes could comprehend. The tactical, temporary loss of the future king to ensure his ultimate survival. The weight on the roof shifted again, heavier this time, followed by the sickening crunch of frozen earth being chipped away. The light of the Medes was about to flood their hidden world, and the lieutenant knew the time for silent resistance was over. He had to act now, using the very structures of betrayal and fear against the empire that created them.
beginning the desperate game of hiding a king in plain sight.
The decision shattered the icy silence of the subterranean chamber. Every breath Astyages' spies drew felt like a dagger aimed at the cradle. The earth-insulated walls, meant to be a fortress against the brutal desert night, had become a soundboard, amplifying the terror of discovery. A fragile shell waiting to be cracked open by Median paranoia. Silence was no longer protection. It was collaboration with his own demise. The game of patience had exploded into a desperate sprint for survival, forcing a nobleman, a man of quiet honor who had merely sought to protect his kin, to become a master manipulator in the court of the Median Serpent King. He had to instantly assume the mantle of the spy, the informer, the fiercely loyal servant, all to shield the bloodline that promised to shatter the Median chains forever. The time for the true fight had arrived, and it demanded the ultimate sacrifice of identity. Outside, the wind howled, a chilling soundtrack mimicking the bloodhounds of Ecbatana. The eyes and ears of Astyages, a network of informants more pervasive and venomous than any known secret police, were already tracking the slightest whispers of unusual activity in the Anshan region. They didn't need irrefutable proof of treachery. They needed only suspicion, and suspicion was a currency they spent freely, paid for in the lifeblood of Persian nobles who dared to think independently. His first move, dictated by sheer necessity, was the most dangerous, betraying a lesser, manufactured secret to protect the monumental secret of the future king. A critical diversion, a sacrificial pawn to draw the viper's gaze away from the true target before the viper could strike. He needed to leak a rumor so juicy, so seemingly dangerous, that the entire Median intelligence apparatus would choke on the complexity of it for days, giving him precious time to organize the next phase of the escape. The fate of the world hinged on a convincing lie. He moved through the house, the polished stones of the floor cold beneath his sandals, towards the hidden cavity behind the sacred flame altar, a place known only to the highest echelons of the Achaemenid lineage. Within lay the tools of ancient resistance, small, meticulously rolled scrolls marked not with identifiable words but with familial crests and coded signals passed down through generations of the clan. A communication network buried deep beneath the crushing veneer of Median control. This wasn't a call for a military muster. Not yet. It was a desperate, immediate plea for silence and meticulous preparation, sent via trusted muleteers, itinerant merchants, and nomadic goat herders who traversed the desolate passes of the Zagros Mountains. These men were the true, invisible arteries of the highlands, moving fluidly through areas where Median garrisons dared not tread, carrying messages woven subtly into the fabric of daily commerce, hidden in the lining of satchels and the tags on livestock. Their loyalty was to the ancient soil, not to the Median tyrant. His most agonizing duty was the compulsory report to the local Median satrap, a greasy, ambitious governor named Ramesses. He had to present himself as the most terrified, most compliant noble in the region, practically tripping over himself in his eagerness to serve the Median crown. He needed to sell his loyalty with every trembling word, every subservient bow, convincing Ramesses that Astyages' paranoia was absolutely justified, but that he was the governor's indispensable ally in crushing this nascent resistance. He crafted his face into a mask of abject fear and obedience, knowing that Ramesses was a creature of suspicion who rewarded sycophancy with temporary safety. He had to become everything he despised, inhabiting the role of the willing slave to protect the future sovereign. The pressure was excruciating, a constant physical weight on his chest. One wrong inflection, one moment of genuine defiance or steel in his eyes, and the executioner's blade would settle the matter for all time. He was walking a tightrope of ice over a chasm of Median ruthlessness, tasked with protecting the seed of an entire future empire, while constantly playing the part of its most humble subject. The message he finally authorized to be leaked was simple, chilling, and manufactured entirely from thin air. The Babylonian envoys are stirring trouble near Pasargadae, attempting to finance local banditry and arm the hill tribes. It was a perfectly plausible lie. Babylon was a known active enemy of Media, and it directed the Medes' deadly, short-sighted attention far away from the child king's true hiding place in the Earth House. The immediate relief was immense, a wave of cold air washing over his soul. But the satisfaction of the diversion was immediately tempered by the grim knowledge that Ramesses, the Median governor, would now demand absolute proof of this claim. He would demand the immediate capture of these imaginary Babylonian agents, and if none were produced, the lie would collapse, exposing the Persian noble to unimaginable torture. He had bought mere hours, perhaps a single day of grace, but the clock was already ticking down violently to zero. The necessity was clear. He had to create an entirely new, believable reality, a complete phantom war to keep the Medes distracted from the infant king who slept quietly in the insulated dark, utterly unaware that his mere existence was tearing the ancient world apart and demanding the ultimate deadly performance from those sworn to protect his lineage. The next 24 hours would be a whirlwind of staged arrests and false confessions, a dramatic production designed solely for the gullible Median audience. The biting wind was not the only chill permeating the Earth House now. A deeper, psychological frost had set in, born of necessary betrayal. Outside, under the indifferent gaze of the winter moon, 4 trusted but ultimately expendable Persian administrators were being marched toward the temporary garrison, their fates sealed by the grim, meticulous script drawn up just hours before. These men, loyal to the very end, understood their crucial role. They were the sacrificial pawns, the necessary proof demanded by the insatiable, bloodthirsty paranoia of the court at Ecbatana. They would confess, under duress that was entirely real and brutal, to planning a massive tribute diversion, a plot so simple and crude it would satisfy the dull-witted Median regional governor, while meticulously obscuring the true, terrifying scale of the systemic Persian organization that lay hidden beneath the surface. Their staged crimes involved imaginary gold caches hidden near the ancient, dilapidated Elamite ruins, a beautiful, plausible lie designed purely to send the Median search parties chasing ghosts for weeks, wasting precious time they desperately needed to survive. The air inside the command khanate was thick with the scent of dried herbs and simmering terror. But the elder Cambyses, the Achaemenid patriarch bearing the crushing weight of his lineage, maintained a face of glacial stone, reviewing the minute out painstaking details of the confessions one final, agonizing time. Every inflection, every manufactured sob, every broken man was a specific, calculated note in the treacherous symphony of their survival. The danger was instantaneously localized in the hulking, unavoidable figure of Commander Mardonius, a median brute whose only discernible ambition was promotion, and whose only documented skill was loud, unquestioning, often violent obedience. Mardonius arrived late morning, his heavy bronze armor scraping audibly against the low, supportive wooden lintel of the main entrance, bringing with him the immediate stench of the northern steppes and the arrogant, unfounded certainty of unchallenged Median dominance. He demanded to see the evidence, and crucially, the traitors immediately, his suspicious eyes sweeping the meager, deliberately austere furnishings of the earth house. He expected wealth and glaring ostentatious corruption from traitors. Instead, he found meticulous, calculated poverty, designed to project an image of stoic, unwavering dedication to frugal state service. The elder Cambyses played his part flawlessly, trembling slightly, offering Mardonius the last of their stored vintage wine, lamenting the shock and profound betrayal of his trusted, high-ranking staff, and continually emphasizing his own unwavering, almost obsequious loyalty to King Astyages, the desperate, pathetic loyalty of a dog, fearing the imminent, inevitable crack of the whip. Mardonius, notoriously satisfied by the immediate sight of the beaten, visibly confessing administrators, and the clear, detailed, though entirely fabricated, ledger discrepancies laid out before him, finally ceased his interrogation and barked his thick-tongued approval. He summarily declared the localized matter closed, preparing rapidly to send his triumphant report back to the capital at Ecbatana, confirming the successful rooting out of a minor, localized administrative plot with minimal fuss. This was the precise moment of their most profound, crushing risk, successfully convincing the predatory beast that it had finally eaten its full and was ready to sleep. But the sophisticated Medes were not known for their intellectual laziness. The peace was merely temporary, a dangerous, fleeting illusion. The instant Mardonius's large, cumbersome contingent vanished over the frozen crest of the nearby hills, the fragile facade protecting them instantly shattered, replaced by a sudden, frenetic, silent and coordinated activity within the depths of the earth house. This was not safety. This was merely a heavily timed interlude, a brief grace period before the inevitable. The Medes were satisfied for now, but the true architects of this deep persecution, the subtle Machiavellian minds within Astyages' royal court, would soon analyze the report and realize the confessed plot was far too small, too localized, a mere insect bite compared to the systemic rot and rising Persian power they truly feared. Time was now measured exclusively in rapid, pounding heartbeats. The most critical possession they owned was not gold or weaponry, but the scrolls, the irreplaceable lineage records of the Achaemenid clan, tracing their divine mandate back through generations of kings. The very documents that proved their indisputable right to rule Persia, secured within triple-layered goatskin and encased in waterproofed clay seals. These heavy scrolls, the physical, sacred manifestation of their impending rebellion and their future claim to regional legitimacy, were instantly transferred from the deep, secret cavity beneath the central hearth to the hardened leather saddlebags of their single most trusted scout, a formidable man known only as Raksha, whose innate knowledge of the treacherous Zagros passes was legendary and unmatched. The ultimate, crushing decision, made in whispered consensus around a rapidly cooling brazier, was simple and terrifying in its scope. They would not disperse. Dispersal meant immediate, silent assimilation into the median population, and assimilation meant the instantaneous death of the Achaemenid dream of an independent Persian state. They would consolidate their forces instead. Their immediate, harrowing destination was the remote, often unconquered region of Parsa, far to the distant southeast, a harsh, unforgiving landscape populated entirely by tribes fiercely independent and historically resistant to any form of Median oversight. This was the very heartland of true, unsubdued, ancient Persia. Getting there meant traversing hundreds of kilometers of treacherous, snow-choked mountain passes, while simultaneously avoiding every major Median checkpoint, supply depot, and surveillance road. Cambyses knew instinctively that they desperately needed a banner, a cause that transcended mere regional political maneuvering or administrative complaints. They were not simply fleeing injustice or localized corruption. They were answering a summons older than Astyages' empire, a visceral, ancient call to restore the forgotten, sacred glory of their ancestors, unifying the scattered Persian tribes under a single, formidable, and utterly devoted leadership, ready for war. Just as the first critical sliver of the plan was enacted, the movement of key leadership personnel and the vital, irreplaceable supplies, the alarm suddenly sounded. It was not the loud, predictable roar of Mardonius's heavy returning force, but the sharp, piercing, unmistakable cry of a lone owl, the highly coded warning signal of their outermost, highest sentry. A small, aggressive patrol, detached from a distant Median garrison and operating completely independently, had stumbled upon Raksha's recently laid trail. They were close, dangerously close, mere minutes away. This was the terrifying moment of no return, the absolute tipping point. All pretense of quiet, calculated departure was instantly and violently abandoned. "Go! Now!" Cambyses roared, his voice shattering the absolute silence that had protected their family for decades in that subterranean dwelling. The young heir, the future Cyrus the Great, bundled against the intense freezing cold and the overwhelming terror of the moment, was abruptly thrust onto a waiting pony, secured by trusted hands. They burst violently from the Earth House sanctuary, leaving behind the warmth, the guaranteed safety, the very concept of home and stability, trading it all for the cold, unforgiving promise of a revolution forged in the mountains. The subterranean refuge, the very symbol of their stability and resistance, was now instantly just a cold, silent grave, waiting to be investigated by their relentless enemies. Their flight was loud, desperate, and terrifyingly irreversible, marking the true, bloody beginning of the great Persian migration, not as cowering refugees, but as the sparks of the future empire, exploding into the merciless, frozen Median night. Every single hoofbeat across the frozen, unforgiving ground was a declaration of total war, a direct challenge hurled with immense force at the opulent, paranoid, and ultimately fragile heart of King Astyages. The final hunt had officially begun, and the ultimate prize was not merely survival, but the dominion over all known civilized lands. The seismic tremor of Astyages' command shook the Persian Highlands, not with a roar, but with a terrifying, silent vibration that traveled through the very packed earth of their homes. It was the sound of destiny arriving at the doorstep of the forgotten, the echo of iron cavalry pounding toward every remote subterranean dwelling that dared to conceal a free Persian heart. The hunt was not discreet. It was a scorched earth mandate designed to root out the rebels like weeds, leaving nothing but dust and terror in its wake. The supposed safety of the earth-insulated homes, those deep, warm pockets carved into the hostile mountain slopes, evaporated in an instant, turning sanctuaries into potential traps. If Astyages had commanded a siege against a great walled city, the defenders would have known where to stand. But his wrath was distributed, a creeping poison infiltrating every hidden valley and secluded shepherd's trail. He unleashed the full, terrifying might of the Median military establishment. Not just border garrisons, but the elite forces, the infamous Purple Eagles, whose standards struck dread into the hearts of every vassal kingdom. These were the professional terror agents of the ancient world, clad in gleaming armor, riding horses bred for endurance, trained to recognize the subtle signs of human habitation in the desolate terrain. Their commanders operated under a single, brutal directive: identify any community potentially harboring loyalty to Cyrus, isolate it, and make an example of its complete erasure. No mercy was to be shown. The Medes understood that fear was a far more effective long-term occupying force than standing armies, and the Persians were about to be taught that lesson in blood and fire. For the common folk, huddled deep inside their cold, damp chambers, the world above became a terrifying drumbeat. They listened to the muffled, heavy sounds of hooves passing over the very roofs of their homes, a sound that meant instant death if a flicker of lamplight, a stray whisper, or the smell of cooking smoke betrayed their position. Children, usually boisterous even in the face of deep cold, were held rigidly silent, their small gasps swallowed by fear, as the shadow of the Median Empire drifted across their fragile existence. Every movement became a monumental risk: fetching water, tending the meager flocks, even breathing too loudly could invite a sudden, brutal intrusion through the narrow entrance shaft. Cyrus, operating from a constantly shifting, heavily fortified command center, carved into the most inaccessible mountains, received the reports, and the chilling truth crystallized. Astyages was not negotiating, he was eliminating. This was no longer a political dispute. It was an existential war of survival for the entire Persian people. The strategy of passive hiding, the initial hope that the sheer difficulty of the terrain and the vastness of the highlands would deter the Median pursuit, was now revealed as a fatal fantasy. Waiting meant slow strangulation, watching his people hunted down one small community at a time until the core of the rebellion withered. The subterranean homes, while offering superb insulation against the brutal cold, became liabilities when surrounded. Escape was nearly impossible, and once discovered, the Medes needed only to seal the entrance and wait. Cyrus knew he had only one choice left. He had to take the fight to the enemy, turning the hunter into the hunted, before the darkness swallowed them whole. His immediate priority was the mobilization of the fragmented clans. The Persians were decentralized, independent, and fiercely loyal to their immediate tribal leaders, a structure that had been their historical strength, but was now a devastating weakness against a unified imperial army.
He dispatched his most trusted messengers, riders who knew every goat path and hidden spring, carrying the urgent message, unity or annihilation. The message was simple. The earth cannot hide us forever. We must become the mountain itself, striking from unexpected angles.
This transition from defense to offense required a rapid, almost impossible change in mindset, demanding that shepherds and farmers become expert guerrilla fighters overnight. Cyrus capitalized on the one advantage they possessed, the intimate knowledge of the land, weaponizing the geography that the Medes treated with arrogant disdain. He ordered his nascent forces to abandon open confrontations, which would invariably result in massive losses against the superior Median cavalry, and instead focus on asymmetric warfare. Every narrow canyon became a potential killing field, every winding pass a meticulously prepared trap, designed to neutralize the Medes' superior numbers and heavy armor. The first successful engagements were brutal, desperate affairs fought under the cloak of night and freezing fog. A Median patrol, confident and heavily armed, was lured into a treacherous gorge, where Persian slingers and archers, positioned high on the ridges, rained down death from unseen positions. The Medes, accustomed to fighting organized lines on open plains, panicked in the confined space, their horses rearing and slipping on the icy rock, their centralized command structure crumbling under the decentralized ambush. The Persians, lightly armed and moving like ghosts, struck the killing blow, then instantly melted back into the shadows of the peaks, leaving nothing but carnage and confusion behind. These small victories, gained at tremendous cost, were not strategic game changers, but they were vital injections of morale, proving that the Purple Eagles were not invincible, merely men who bled the same way. More importantly, they sent a terrifying signal back to Astyages. The Persians were fighting back. The emperor, receiving reports that his elite troops were being harassed, ambushed, and even occasionally wiped out by what he considered barely civilized mountain bandits, descended into a renewed frenzy of paranoia. He doubled down on his initial mistake, ordering larger, more brutal sweeps that inevitably targeted innocent communities out of sheer frustration. This escalating cruelty was exactly what Cyrus needed. The Median terror was now unintentionally forging the scattered Persian tribes into a cohesive, vengeful unit. The choice was no longer about political loyalty. It was a stark binary: fight for Cyrus or die under the heel of Astyages' unending tyranny. The earth-insulated homes of the Highlands, which had represented safety and isolation, now represented the ultimate motivation for war, the desperate right to simply live in the soil that nurtured them. The ultimate gamble had begun, and the fate of the known world hinged on whether a handful of determined rebels could break the spine of the ancient, opulent, and fiercely powerful Median Empire. The silence that followed the declaration of war was not peace. It was the sound of a coiled viper drawing breath before it struck. In Ecbatana, the glittering heart of the Median Empire, King Astyages, the aging tyrant whose paranoia had become the bedrock of his rule, did not merely hear the news. He felt the betrayal like a poisoned dagger twisting in his gut. This was not a border skirmish. This was the ultimate, unforgivable insult from his own grandson, Cyrus. The opulent halls, usually echoing with the sycophantic murmurings of courtiers, were now filled with the roar of a monarch realizing his life's great error. He should have murdered the child when he had the chance. The cold logic of power demanded immediate, devastating retribution, a response so overwhelming that it would erase the very memory of Persian resistance from the mountain valleys. Astyages immediately summoned the legions, the heavy-armored cataphracts who were the terror of the Near East, their bronze scales shining with the captured wealth of 100 subject kingdoms. He demanded that the Persian rebellion be extinguished not just quickly, but totally, leaving behind only salt and ash where the earth homes once stood. But this immense task of crushing a localized revolt in the unforgiving Highlands could not be entrusted to just any general. It required a mind as cold and calculating as the king himself, someone who understood the logistical nightmare of mountain warfare. Astyages, blinded by fury, turned to his most trusted military commander, the man who had served him ruthlessly for decades, the very man who had once been tasked with eliminating the infant Cyrus, Harpagus. The irony of appointing the man whose son had been brutally served to him as a meal was a cruel twist of fate. But Astyages was too far gone in his rage to recognize the deep, festering resentment buried beneath Harpagus's loyal facade. Harpagus accepted the command, a flicker of something ancient and terrible passing through his eyes. He was given an army of unprecedented size, a force designed to steamroll nations, not chase desperate rebels through rocky passes. The Median host began its slow, inevitable march toward the land of Anshan, a river of steel and polished leather pouring out of the capital city, its thunder heard across the high plateau. This was the true test for Cyrus. He was not just fighting the Medes, he was fighting the infrastructure, the wealth, and the organizational genius that kept the colossal empire running. His small, dedicated force, composed mostly of fiercely independent Persian clansmen, skilled archers, and light cavalry adapted to the harsh terrain, was woefully mismatched against the professional war machine bearing down on them. Cyrus knew that direct confrontation was suicide. The Median cataphracts, the armored knights on horseback, were unstoppable on open plains, a juggernaut of momentum that could shatter any infantry line. But the Persians had one advantage the Medes did not. The mountains were their mother, and the freezing, dust-choked passes were their fortress. The strategy was simple, if terrifyingly risky. Bleed the giant dry. Exhaust their supply lines, exploit their arrogance, and never, ever fight on their terms. Every ravine became an ambush point, every narrow defile a deadly chokehold where 2,000 men could be stopped by 20 determined archers. The initial skirmishes were brutal lessons in asymmetry. Harpagus, moving with the methodical precision of a seasoned veteran, sought to trap Cyrus in the flatter grazing lands south of Parsa, attempting to use his massive infantry lines to push the Persians back, relying on sheer weight of numbers to crush the spirit of the rebels. But the Persians were ghosts. They would appear out of the biting wind, unleash a storm of composite arrows designed to pierce the gaps in the Median armor, and vanish back into the shadows of the crags before the Medes could even properly deploy their heavy cavalry. They mastered the hit and run, the feigned retreat, the devastating surprise attack at midnight when the cold was at its most lethal. The Median soldiers, accustomed to easy victories over disorganized farmers or wealthy but soft Lydian merchants, found themselves battling a foe that seemed to melt into the landscape. They suffered heavily from the brutal cold and the constant, unnerving stress of being watched. Their rich supplies were strained by the long, difficult haul through terrain engineered by nature to resist easy passage. Fodder was scarce, and morale began to dip dangerously. Harpagus was frustrated, but professionally detached. He understood that the rebels were merely delaying the inevitable, but the delays were costing him valuable soldiers and resources. He tightened the noose, focusing on strategic water sources and known clan centers, aiming to starve the Persians into submission and force them down from the peaks. Meanwhile, inside the earth-insulated homes, the supposed havens of safety, the reality of war was immediate and terrifying. The deep, dark chambers carved out of the bedrock became full-time prisons. Women and children were forced into deeper, hidden recesses, relying on centuries-old knowledge of subterranean survival, praying for the sound of retreating hooves. The air inside was thick with fear and the smell of rendered fat used for lamps. The usual comforting insulation now felt like suffocating pressure. Every muffled sound from above, a distant shout, the clatter of bronze on stone, the braying of a Median mule, was magnified into an omen of impending doom, signaling the presence of the massive enemy force. The earth that once offered protection now felt like a shallow grave, waiting to be disturbed by the Median spades. Cyrus, fighting miles away, knew that every hour he kept the Medes occupied was an hour that bought his people safety. But the clock was ticking down to zero, and the strategic goal shifted radically. Harpagus intended to corner Cyrus near the passes leading into Susiana, forcing a decisive battle on the relatively flatter plains. But Cyrus had already planned for this convergence. He didn't want to fight near the border. He wanted to draw the Medes deep into the heart of the Persian domain, where every stone had a history and every path was a deadly secret only known to the locals. The ultimate confrontation was being set up not by military genius alone, but by geography and the relentless, unforgiving will of the Persian people, who refused to submit to the golden tyranny of Ecbatana. The next phase of the war would be fought not with grand armies, but with starvation, ambush, and the chilling realization for Harpagus that his troops were fighting a land that was actively trying to kill them. The stage was set for the legendary Battle of the Persian Border, the fight that would decide if the world remembered the name Cyrus. But first, Harpagus had to endure the agonizing, bloody journey through the endless, hostile mountains, chasing a phantom king who was always one critical step ahead. The Median Empire, drunk on its own power, was about to discover the terrible resilience of those who have nothing left to lose but their freedom. The blood spilled was not just a warning. It was a ritual sacrifice marking the end of the age of submission. That cold desert dust, once merely earth, was now a witness to the greatest betrayal in history. The subterranean homes, those bastions of fragile warmth, suddenly felt less like shelters and more like tombs, sealed against the inevitable tide of Median fury. Astyages, the lion of Ecbatana, was not merely hunting traitors. He was attempting to erase the very concept of Persian independence, a concept that was now taking physical form in the person of a young prince. His father, Cambyses I, the king of Anshan, lived a life perpetually under the crushing weight of a foreign crown. His title was a cruel joke, a puppet string held taut by Astyages' iron grip, demanding tribute, sons, and absolute, groveling loyalty. Cambyses understood the language of the Median court was not diplomacy, but dread, and he played the role of the loyal, subservient vassal with chilling, agonizing perfection, all the while knowing the dagger was perpetually pointed straight at his son's throat.
Astyages' paranoia was a weapon forged in the crucible of absolute power, and it sharpened every time he looked south toward the rugged, defiant mountain ranges where the Persians clustered, resilient and unbroken. He knew the ancient stories of the Achaemenids, the legendary line tracing back to the mythical founder Achaemenes himself, a lineage too proud, too deeply rooted in the soil to be permanently subjugated by outsiders.
The Median spies, cloaked in heavy, earth-colored sheepskins against the freezing, relentless winds, now swarmed the critical Pasargadae region with devastating efficiency. They were mapping every underground dwelling, noting every suspicious flicker of lamplight that might betray a hidden forge or a secret meeting, reporting every single whisper of discontent back to the lavish yet utterly terrified palace in Ecbatana. The true, secret power of the Persian people lay in their profound organization, a fierce, organized resilience that few of the surrounding empires truly grasped or respected. There were 10 tribes in total, 3 considered nobler than the rest, 7 categorized as common folk. But it was the powerful military coalition of the Pasargadae, the Marafi, and the Masbi that held the true, simmering, revolutionary potential. The Pasargadae, being the most prominent and the direct ancestral line of the Achaemenids, were the royal core, the ones whose earth-insulated dwellings held the most vital secrets of the burgeoning resistance. These secrets were meticulously carved into the bedrock, hidden deeper than any Median agent dared to dig, hidden from the constant threat of treacherous, high-level Median gaze. Imagine the unbearable, heart-stopping scene. A family huddled around a meager, smoking fire pit, the smoke stinging their eyes with sharp intensity. Yet the paralyzing fear of discovery was infinitely sharper than the smoke. Every single conversation was reduced to a harsh whisper. Every vital plan was drawn in the dust of the floor and then instantly, violently erased before the embers cooled. Their survival hinged on an absolute, terrifying silence, an unwavering discipline that bordered on mental torture. If even a single Median agent discovered that the vassal king Cambyses was secretly mobilizing his people, using the blessed isolation of the highlands to his incredible advantage, the resulting purge would leave nothing but smoking ruins, empty, lifeless earth homes, and mass graves dotting the landscape. And in the heart of this desperate silence, the young Cyrus was being rigorously prepared. He was not taught the soft, deceptive comforts of court life, but the brutal, uncompromising, and absolutely necessary wisdom of the Persian mountains. He learned to ride bareback across impossible, jagged terrain until his muscles screamed, to endure the constant, debilitating cold without a single complaint. And, most importantly, he learned the true, unforgivable history of their humiliation, a history etched into his very soul by his grandfather's silent, burning fury and his father's decade-long, calculated, humiliating subservience. Meanwhile, miles away, in the glittering yet fundamentally treacherous Median capital of Ecbatana, the great general Harpagus, the man whose own burning ambition was inextricably tied to Astyages' inevitable downfall, was executing the long, terrifying game of high treason. Harpagus was the cold, silent eye of the storm, the man Astyages trusted implicitly. He was the one executing Astyages' cruelest, most violent decrees, yet every order he followed was simultaneously a brick laid in the foundation of his own staggering vengeance and the looming Persian revolt. His terrifying proximity to the Median king allowed him to expertly manipulate the flow of military intelligence, strategically exaggerating certain minor threats while constantly minimizing the true systemic danger that was brewing with incredible speed in Anshan. The entire Median court was utterly convinced that the Persian problem was completely contained, a minor irritation managed effortlessly by a diligent, easily manipulated puppet king. They vastly underestimated the depth of the planning, the sheer, cold, and unwavering resolve of a people who had mastered the delicate art of survival by living literally beneath the surface of the world, hidden from sight. They fatally failed to account for the core truth that a man who has nothing left to lose, a man like Cambyses, whose only son was marked for summary execution, will fight with the sheer, terrifying ferocity of a trapped, wounded lion. He would sacrifice everything, even the assumed safety of his underground home, to ensure his son's destiny. The irreversible signal was coming fast. A series of seemingly innocuous exchanges, specific coded types of trade goods moving through the mountain passes. A meticulously planned coded message hidden deep within the manifest of a caravan of spices. A prearranged specific astronomical event, only known to a select few, would trigger the irreversible, bloody rebellion. The earth-insulated homes were about to cease being mere shelters and instantly transform into centralized command centers for a world war. The cold desert night was no longer just a severe climatic feature. It was the necessary, perfect cloak under which the first decisive strikes of the Persian Revolution would be secretly and violently launched. The stakes had transcended mere survival. They now encompassed the ultimate fate of the entire known world. And the spark that lit this colossal fire was hidden deep beneath the cold, unforgiving Persian soil. The stillness was broken, not by the tremor of an earthquake, but by the far more terrifying vibration of human fear echoing through the stone and packed earth. Every single person huddled inside those cold, dark gold khanehs, the subterranean homes, knew the median eye had finally focused its terrifying gaze directly upon them. The fragile illusion of safety, built upon centuries of isolation, and the sheer difficulty of traversing the arid Persian plateau had completely shattered. King Astyages, the mighty tyrant of the Medes, was not merely suspicious anymore. He was certain that the bloodline of Achaemenid carried the seed of his own destruction, and he intended to rip that seed from the ground. This wasn't just a political skirmish, my friends. This was the ultimate hunt, the supreme power of the ancient world targeting a handful of desperate families hiding in holes in the ground. Astyages had moved beyond diplomatic threats and veiled surveillance. He was now enacting Operation Scorched Earth, a campaign designed to make the Persian Highlands utterly uninhabitable for anyone loyal to the Achaemenid lineage. This was a clear message, a move designed to cripple the future military capacity of the Persians before it could ever be mobilized. Astyages wanted tribute, yes, but what he truly craved was the absolute subjugation of the Persian spirit, the removal of any potential successor before he even reached manhood. The cold air itself seemed to carry the metallic scent of Median armor, and the sound of their heavy boots crunching the icy gravel across the sparsely populated landscape. The Persians, masters of camouflage and silent movement, watched these movements from hidden vantage points. From the high crags of the Zagros Mountains, their eyes burning with quiet, disciplined rage. Inside the deepest subterranean chamber, the leadership council gathered. Cambyses I, the king of Anshan and father of the young Cyrus, known for his stoicism and his almost unnerving calm, presided over the agonizing debate. The earth walls, usually a symbol of protection, now felt like the walls of a coffin, sealing them in with their fear and indecision.
Should they wait? Should they negotiate? Should they sacrifice a few border settlements to preserve the core? Cambyses knew the answer was a resounding, terrifying no. The Medes would not stop until the Achaemenid line was extinct, and the memory of Persian defiance was scrubbed from the historical record.
The time for hiding was definitively over. The time for the earth to be their passive shield was past. Survival now demanded they embrace the very elements that had always tested them: the brutal, open desert, the freezing wind, and the relentless, unforgiving sun. They needed to turn their geography into their greatest weapon. Their strategic advantage lay not in fortifications or numbers, which they lacked completely, but in speed and intimate knowledge of the terrain, the very terrain the Median soldiers despised, considering it beneath their imperial dignity. The Median army was accustomed to garrison life, reliable logistics, and comfortable supply lines. The Persians were born of the wilderness, sustained by dried meat and raw necessity. Cambyses issued the decree that would change history. Operation Scorpion Sting. They would not engage in a suicidal pitched battle against the full might of the Median professional army. Instead, they would become phantom warriors, striking supply lines, ambushing isolated patrols, and drawing the Medes deeper and deeper into the environmental killing fields of the desert plateau. This meant extreme, perilous exposure. It meant abandoning the insulated warmth of the Gol Khaneh for the bone-jarring cold of a winter campaign fought primarily on horseback. It meant turning every single man, woman, and child into a contributor to the survival effort, a silent, vital cog in the war machine being assembled in the shadows. And watching all of this, internalizing the fear, the determination, and the sheer, staggering impossibility of the task, was young Cyrus. Though strategically kept relatively safe, the weight of the crown he had not yet earned was already crushing his youthful shoulders, sharpening his understanding of power and sacrifice. He watched his father, recognizing the terrible burden of leading a nation on the brink of absolute annihilation. A leader forced to commit his entire people to a war that statistically they could not possibly win against such overwhelming odds. But cold mathematics meant nothing to the fiery spirit of the Achaemenids. Their history, etched in the raw rock walls of their meager dwellings, was a testament to defying statistics and surviving the insurmountable. They were forged in iron necessity, and the Medes were about to learn precisely what happens when you corner a nation of desert-hardened, desperate riders. The first real, tangible warning of bloodshed came just 3 days after the council concluded their tense deliberations. A lone, exhausted rider, barely clinging to his horse and bleeding heavily, collapsed into the outer perimeter of the camp, whispering a single, chilling place name:
Saragart.
The Saragartian tribe, a loyal Persian client group, living closer to the Median heartland and serving as a forward buffer, had been completely wiped out. Not conquered, not subdued, annihilated. Their homes burned to ash, their limited wells poisoned. A clear message delivered with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. Resistance means complete erasure from history. This definitive act of terror solidified Cambyses' resolve. There would be no retreat. There would be no attempt at surrender or negotiation. The only path forward lay in the immediate, violent, and desperate counterattack, using the element of surprise, the sheer audacity of resistance they still possessed. They gathered their meager possessions under the cloak of night, packing dried dates, water skins, and their finely crafted, powerful compound bows. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken goodbyes, the silent understanding that many of these loyal citizens would never return to the comforting, if suffocating, embrace of the earth homes. The moment they emerged, blinking into the harsh, freezing glare of the high plateau sun, they ceased being a hidden people and instantly became a moving target. They were now truly exposed, vulnerable to the Median patrols that perpetually scoured the horizon. But in that exposure, they were also utterly free. The ultimate, bitter irony of the situation was complete. To survive the existential threat of the Median Empire, they had to abandon the very structure that had kept them physically alive and safe for generations. The cold desert night was no longer a silent threat. It was now their new, vast, and deadly ally. The desperate war for the ancient world had finally, violently, left its bunker.